Chinese leaders are desperately reaching out for markets in Africa to help pull China's economy out of the quagmire. But chances are that no African assistance is forthcoming. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Mark your calendars, my friends, on Saturday, October 12th at 8 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. I will be hosting a special live stream celebrating you for helping us reach 2 million subscribers. And you'll want to be there. There will be some big announcements about the future of the show, and Matt, Shelley, and I will do something we've never done before. Again, that's Saturday, October 12th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. See you there. So, have you heard that China is saving Africa? It's all over Chinese state-run media. Chinese efforts are greatly improving the lives of African farming communities. Chinese mining projects are empowering locals, especially women, through new job opportunities. And Chinese volunteers are protecting African wildlife by fighting off poachers trying to get Africa's elephants. And here I thought that it was the Chinese demand for elephant tusks that had previously been driving African elephants towards extinction, and that Chinese leaders were generally pushing for a very different role for women. But don't let me spoil the party with context. Back to the Chinese version of the tale. All this Chinese service in Africa has resulted in the creation of more than 1.1 million jobs just in recent years, through investments in industries such as agriculture, processing and manufacturing, trade and logistics. With these investments, Chinese modernization has entered the lives and work of African people, bringing new ideas and methods, and always doing so with humility and grace. After all, who can forget back in 2011 when the CCP sent this Chinese head of logistics to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he lavished praise on them for their successes in front of a documentary crew. Wow. Right now that guy's thinking, get me out of here, and I don't blame him. I wonder if they're going to remake Black Panther and try to convince them that China is responsible for building Wakanda. Overall, the whole Chinese media narrative about China and Africa was probably best summed up in a sketch in the Chinese state-run media torchbearer of objectivity, the Global Times. In the illustration, we see a Chinese side represented by high-tech stuff like a space rocket, a satellite, modern medicine, and a doctor, while the African side is represented by a boy receiving medical attention, as well as coconuts, coffee, and a drum. I can't help but notice that the Chinese side is missing forced organ harvesting in concentration camps. It's early. There's still plenty of time for them to bring that to Africa. But despite all this media attention, eager to leave an impression of an Africa in great need of what a modern China can offer, it's actually China that's in desperate need of what Africa can offer. You see, the Chinese economy is on its knees. Official economic growth numbers have been disappointing lately, to say the least. Chinese youth unemployment is soaring, and consumer confidence is nearing an all-time low. But on the bright side, their forced organ harvesting and concentration camp economy is booming. Did I say bright side? I meant blood-splattered side. But as part of a long-term strategy to rejuvenate the Chinese economy, the Chinese government has bet big on certain modern products, especially within the field of green tech. However, that has resulted in oversupply and plummeting prices for things like Chinese electric cars and Chinese solar modules. At the same time, governments across the world are starting to catch on to the CCP's plan to boost its economy by flooding the world with cheap Chinese green tech, heavily pumped up on state subsidies. Just in recent months, both the US and Canada have sharply increased tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, as has the European Union. Because of that, the Chinese leadership is scrambling to find willing markets for China's green tech products, and they have their sights set on Africa. In fact, many of the stories about the blessing that is Chinese involvement in Africa were rolled out by Chinese state media during the run-up to a highly anticipated China-Africa summit held in Beijing earlier this month, which had representatives in attendance from around 50 African nations. The summit is officially called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and it's been held every 3 years since 2000. Going into the summit, Beijing was eager to urge African leaders to take more of its green tech goods before Western curbs kick in on its exports, such as electric vehicles and solar panels. Ah yes, the classic sales pitch of, "You'll love this, even though most of the world doesn't want it." The old rule of supply and please take it. During his key address marking the opening of the summit, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said that China is ready to help Africa push for the global transition to green and low-carbon development. Yes, don't buy from Beijing's overcapacity of over-subsidized green tech products for Xi's sake, buy them for your own sake. And who would know more about reducing carbon than the nation that has more carbon output than all other developed nations combined? Besides, with all that Beijing has done for Africa, African markets being open to Chinese products is a small ask, right? There's just one tiny problem. Chinese affairs in Africa up until this point are not as picture perfect as some would like them to appear. Take Chinese trade with Africa. For more than a decade, China has been Africa's largest trading partner, and last year, total trade amounted to around $282 billion. But that trade is very much skewed in China's favor, with the country exporting $64 billion more than it imports from African countries. A similar point was reportedly raised by the president of South Africa a few days before the summit, when he told Xi that he wants more balanced trade with China for his country versus the current situation, where South Africa imports twice as much as it exports to China. The day after, the finance minister of Angola said that China needs to step up its financing for Angola if the African nation is to absorb more Chinese-made goods from solar panels to electric cars. Chinese lenders provided loans worth about $4.6 billion for African countries last year, which is a far cry from the peak in 2016 when they provided $28.4 billion worth of loans. But there's not just an issue with Chinese financing for Africa drying up. There's also growing African opposition to Chinese projects on the continent. For example, reportedly in Uganda, scores of people are repeatedly being arrested for protesting an almost 900-mile-long oil pipeline project that will transport crude oil from Uganda to the coast of Tanzania. Because China saw there will be blood as a blueprint, they drink your milkshake. Chinese companies are deeply invested in the project, not just through financing, but also through the state-owned China National Offshore Oil Corporation, which is licensed to drill the oil that will eventually pass through the pipeline. In June, thousands across Uganda and Tanzania rallied against the pipeline, partly because to make way for it, around 100,000 people are facing the destruction of their villages. And if you're thinking this sounds like China's copying the plot of some other movie bad guy, yeah, it does. The CCP pays Hollywood so much because they need ideas. Many of these rallies took place near Chinese embassies and consulates because, as one protester explained to Al Jazeera, we are pressuring China and others because they are the ones that will bring the money for this. The Ugandan government can't do it on their own. At the same time, many already completed Chinese projects in Africa have ended up as white elephant projects. These are projects that gulp up millions of dollars but do not generate enough returns to repay the loans that funded them, making them unproductive. That makes white elephant projects the worst white elephant gift you could ever possibly receive. Christmas is ruined. Take the 32-mile-long highway connecting Uganda's capital, Kampala, to the country's international airport, which was completed in 2018 and built using Chinese loans. It is said to be the most expensive road per kilometer in the world, but it has limited access to towns that line its length, which has restricted the economic activity that the expressway was expected to spur. As a result, by 2023, local authorities had only generated $20 million from the project, while Uganda is stuck with a $350 million Chinese loan that it took to build the highway. There are many other examples of unfinished Chinese projects in Africa facing local opposition, as well as finished ones that aren't creating the payoff that was initially expected. Unfortunately, according to a South Africa-based researcher focused on China-Africa relations, there's very little transparency on a lot of Chinese investment in Africa, making it hard to determine what Chinese actors are promising and whether they're fulfilling these promises. This was the case with this China-funded railway project in Kenya. It was supposed to connect the East African nation with its landlocked neighbors, but the railway hasn't gotten further than the middle of the country. Working on it was discontinued in 2019 due to unexplained capital shortfalls. In other words, the money train literally ran out. So it makes sense if many of the African leaders that gathered in Beijing earlier this month don't feel particularly grateful or blessed about Chinese activities in Africa so far, or particularly keen on opening their doors to mountains of cheap Chinese green tech products. They're so poorly produced, they might wind up hurting the environment even more. Then Toto would have to change the lyrics to "I bless the acid rains down in Africa." And they're especially not eager at a time when African business owners are already complaining about competing with Chinese traders flooding markets. A situation that seems to mirror a wider discontent with cheap Chinese-made goods that appear to overshadow made-in-Africa products across the continent. Because all over the world, China's biggest export is disappointment. To persuade African leaders to import Chinese clean tech products, Angola's finance minister said that Beijing's pitch would not only need to include further financing to help bring down high inflation and grow jobs in the short term, but also ensure it had robust industries it could depend on into the future. And Xi did indeed deliver a pitch, pledging to provide around $51 billion in funding for more infrastructure projects and to create at least 1 million jobs. But for an African continent of 54 nations and almost 1.4 billion people, neither pledge is particularly impressive. And you can't trust China given their track record. They literally didn't finish that railway track. The promised funding is also a step back, not even close to the funding numbers announced during previous summits. But if China really wants to woo Africa into importing their green tech, they're going to need to learn from their unfinished and unpopular BRI mistakes, as well as hold back on flooding African markets with Chinese goods. Currently, Chinese activities in Africa are clearly far from perfect, but I know a Chinese head of logistics that worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo who might have a few words for Chinese leadership about that. I hope you learned something interesting in this episode. If you did, please consider supporting the show on patreon.com/China Uncensored. As a thank you, I might answer your question on the show. And today's comes from RB187$. Hey Chris, love the show. I've been a fan since the pandemic. Anyway, my question is, when China is stupid enough to go after Taiwan, how long do you think they'll last if they don't have enough of Taiwan's advanced microchips? Because there's no way Taiwan will let China have those chips. They'll destroy the factories or move their operations to other countries far out of China's reach. Plus, when China attacks, it's not just going to be Taiwan and China fighting. China's whole neighborhood is coming to the party. That's a great question, RB, and honestly, it's something I'm extremely worried about. Taiwan makes some of the most advanced semiconductors in the world. Those are the guts of high-tech computers that run the world. China desperately wants it. The CCP can't manufacture these kind of high-end microchips. That's why the US has so effectively sanctioned China by cutting off their access to semiconductors with things like the CHIP Act. But China just can't invade Taiwan and take over these factories. If they're destroyed, which they likely would be in an invasion, either through combat or sabotage, you can't just rebuild them. They're insanely expensive to build, plus all the expensive equipment, and in particular, the know-how to use it. China just can't seize a semiconductor plant and use it the way it can seize land. But what this means is that if China invades Taiwan, no one in the world will have access to these advanced Taiwanese semiconductors. We'd all be screwed, which is why we desperately need to prevent China from invading in the first place. Thanks for your question, and especially for your support, RB. And thank you for watching. Before you go, here's another video I want to show you. Clicking on it will definitely help us with the YouTube algorithm, and this is a video I made, so I stand behind the quality of it, versus whatever random video YouTube might show you next. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.